Okay, good morning. Thank you for joining today's webinar using WebMi on the Micro OCS. Please submit any questions that you might have about the presentation into the questions panel. This week, your questions are going to be followed up via email, so apologies for the inconvenience on that one. The presentation will be about 15 minutes long, so let's begin.
Welcome to today's tutorial. Let's get started. Let's have a look at our agenda for today. Today, we're looking at using WebMi on the Micro OCS. First, we'll do a quick review of WebMi, where we'll look at what is WebMi, what are the different applications for WebMi, and the differences between using WebMi inside and outside the facility. Then, we'll look in detail at the workflow for adding WebMi to a Micro OCS project. Then, we'll have a demonstration and we'll finish with a Q&A session. So what is WebMi? WebMi is the capability for Horner all-in-one controllers to serve up web pages over Ethernet from its local memory slot. The web pages are typically used for remote monitoring, control, or both. Those web pages are created within Cscape in the graphics editor. All the objects that are available for you to put on an OCS screen, such as data objects, bar graphs, and analog objects, are all available for you to put on a web page. The web pages that are created in Cscape are based on HTML5, and they're compatible with nearly all web browsers that are available on mobile devices, computers, etc. WebMi with the Micro OCS series is only used in asynchronous mode. For synchronous, see our XL series range. Let's talk about WebMi applications. First, let's talk about using WebMi in a factory type environment. You might use WebMi inside of a factory to monitor machinery and equipment for operational purposes. Maybe you want to remotely start a piece of equipment, or maybe you want to remotely monitor what's happening on a piece of equipment. You could also use WebMi to monitor data in the equipment itself, for example in a preventative maintenance program, or to remotely monitor production efficiency programs. Applications for WebMi aren't restricted to factories. You could also have a control or monitoring type application in a campus environment, for example on agricultural sites. Now let's look at using WebMi inside of a facility. In this scenario, all our equipment is being monitored inside a facility. This factory has a local area network which is maintained by the IT department and has Wi-Fi access points to provide wireless access to that LAN to certain devices and certain personnel. You have a variety of computers that are on that LAN. You also have personnel with mobile phones or tablets that are authorized for use inside the facility. There's nothing special in that case that needs to be done to support WebMi. Additionally, people who have access to that LAN are assigned a WebMi username and password for WebMi access from their browser, or maybe to access a certain piece of equipment that's being monitored. Now let's look at using WebMi outside of a facility. Here we're looking at accessing data from inside the facility while being outside the facility. Here is a typical environment where certain personnel have an IT-managed VPN or virtual private network access to the facility from their home or from wherever they are working. If they want to use WebMi, they can use that VPN as a secure means to access their Micro OCS or other controller over WebMi. The only extra thing they need is the username and password for that piece of equipment that was created in WebMi itself. Another approach is having dedicated IoT gateways that are designed to provide remote access to equipment from outside the factory environment. These gateways are common and have been used for many years. A third scenario is where you have a company which says that they're not going to allow anything that is going to be accessed from a third-party OEM to be accessed from the factory network for the purposes of a maintenance program, for example. In those scenarios, you can put a cell modem on your machine if you want to monitor it. Then that piece of equipment has its own IP address that's accessible over the internet, and there's no way for that piece of equipment to interact with anything else in the factory. Next, we'll look at the workflow for taking a Micro OCS that's running a project and adding WebMi to that. This process is slightly different than it is for the XL series. The first part of the workflow concerns the project file. First, of course, you have to use Cscape to program the control and monitoring capability that you want your OCS to accomplish, and then you need to test that program. Once that's complete, you take that Cscape file that's running on the controller and then duplicate and rename it. You'll use that duplicated file when you're creating the WebMi type application. Next, you open that duplicated file and go into hardware configuration, and from that you change the target to Web Designer. You must also select the base resolution for your web pages. There's 3 resolutions available: 1920 by 1080, 1200 by 800 and 1024 by 768. Regardless of which resolution you choose, you'll be able to see these pages on a tablet, phone or on a computer, and they'll scale up and down as needed at runtime. The next steps are about developing your web pages. So in Cscape, in that project that's been configured for Web Designer, you'll go into the graphics editor. The web pages could be duplicates of what's already running on that piece of equipment, but keep in mind you're going to have a higher resolution on your web pages than you do on the OCS that's serving up those web pages. So you could just scale those screens up to be bigger or have multiple of your original screens displayed on a single web page. You could also just design your web pages from scratch, which is just the same as designing screens. Once you've designed the web pages the way you want them, you need to create username and password credentials for different personnel to be able to access the OCS using WebMi. After that, you need to acquire and deploy a license for this controller to run WebMi. WebMi is not an included free feature, although it does have a limited version available for free, which allows 5 data objects on one screen. However, the most popular option is a WebMi license, which is a one-time upgrade that you acquire from Horner or from your local distributor. Once you've deployed that license, you can publish and test your web pages. You publish those pages by moving or copying those onto the micro SD card that's writing on your unit. That can be done by manually copying the WebMi folder that Cscape creates, or it can be done over FTP, where Cscape will download those files over Ethernet, for instance. Next, let's begin our demonstration where we'll show this workflow for adding WebMi to the micro OCS. So for step 1, we had to program our OCS to run an application, which is what I did here. Here I have a micro OCS that's running an epoxy machine, and I have tested it to make sure it's working. The next step is to duplicate and rename the Cscape file running on the micro OCS, and then open that file and reconfigure it for Web Designer. So here's my desktop, and here's my original file that I developed for the micro OCS, and then I duplicated it and renamed it, giving it a different name. Next, we need to reconfigure the duplicate file for Web Designer and pick our base resolution. So in Cscape, in that duplicated file, we go to the hardware configuration. You can see it's currently configured for the micro OCS X4, so I'll change the series to Web Designer. Now we have our choice of a variety of different resolutions. I'll pick 1200 by 800. Next, we need to modify and create graphics for our web pages. So we'll do that in the Cscape graphics editor. So in our project, I'll go to the graphics editor. Remember, this is a duplicate of the program that's running in the OCS, which includes the graphics. And as you can see, we started with an X4 that had a relatively low resolution compared to the 1200 by 800 web page that we're designing here. In my original project, I only had 2 screens, so I could just delete these screens and start over again and design the web pages to look the way I want. Or I could reuse these screens and scale them up, or bring multiple screens onto the same web page. So now I'll cut to show my graphics for my web page when they're complete. So here's my graphics. Here I took the 2 screens I had running on my micro OCS and copied them to the same web page so I can remotely monitor and control my application. I got rid of my jump buttons because I no longer need them, since I'm keeping everything on the one web page. Whenever you create a web project with multiple web pages, you use jump buttons to jump between the web pages. I've also set up some production data information and some preventative maintenance information here as well. This is all pulling data out of the same micro OCS that's running the epoxy machine. This data is targeted for my production control, while this data is targeted for my preventative maintenance department. So let's go back to our workflow. The next step is to create user credentials and adjust any WebMi settings that we need. So going back to our Cscape project, user credentials are all done in the graphics editor under config and then user security configuration. So far I've created 4 username and password combinations. I've hard-coded them in our application, but you'll probably want to create variables here and then allow your variables to be editable for adding and changing any username and password combinations. I've created 4 here: production, maintenance, supervision, and engineering, with a simple password just for demonstration. We also have an access level. So for any object you have on the screen that has an action to it, whether it's a changing set point or starting or stopping something, or if it's an object that's editable, you can assign an access level to that individual object. That level can vary anywhere from 0 to 7. If you have an object that has an access level of 5, then only users that have an access level of 5 or greater can access that object. In this case, only the maintenance, supervision, and engineering personnel would be able to access that because those credentials all have an access level of 5 or greater. The production user who has an access level of 3 won't be able to operate that object or any object that has an access level that's greater than 3. If you have a screen that you want only to be available to users with a higher access level, then you can set it so that the jump object that jumps to that screen has a high access level and won't be available to users with an access level that's lower than that. The next step is to check this WebMi support here, and then we set the automatic timeout for the user. So if the user doesn't do anything on the screen, after 5 minutes they're going to be logged out automatically by WebMi. So next, there are some WebMi settings that we may want to adjust. So I'll go to Screens and then Web Options. Here you can change the web page title to match whatever you want the title of the web page to be when you use your browser to access this machine. You can set a connection timeout interval of your choice, and if you're using a computer connected to a screen where you want to display a web page continuously, for example on a production monitor, then you may want to check this inhibit session timeout. Under advanced properties, there are some keep alive and publishing intervals and authentication types that you may want to adjust. Generally, you can leave those at the default. For some of those IoT access or IoT gateways that we talked about earlier, you may want to change from digest authentication to basic authentication, but in general, most of the time you can leave those at default. The next step is to acquire and deploy the WebMi license for your micro OCS. So let's check and see if we have licensed this unit. We can do that licensing directly from Cscape itself. So you go here under the WebMi menu and then hit display/validate WebMi license. Then Cscape, if I'm connected to my OCS, is going to check and see if I have a license for this particular unit that meets or exceeds the number of pages, users, and data points that I'm using here. So this unit is already fully licensed. If it wasn't, this would show up in red and I could hit the upgrade button, which would allow me to input my voucher number and then acquire and deploy that license. The very last step in our workflow is to publish and test our web pages. Going back to Cscape, we go back to our WebMi menu, and then there's a couple of things that we can do. First, we can hit Publish Website here. With this option, Cscape will take all this screen development that we've done and all the settings that we've adjusted and create web pages that reflect that. Then it will take those files and it will attempt to send them using FTP or File Transfer Protocol to the unit's micro SD card. That requires that FTP is enabled for that particular OCS. Here, instead of using FTP, I did a publish to removable media step, which is at the bottom here. In that case, it created the web pages like it normally would, but put them on the local computer, and then I manually copied those files over to the micro SD card, and then moved that card over to the unit. Now we just need to test it. So let's close Cscape here and open our web browser and look at those web pages that I designed. I'll open up my web browser, and I'll type in the IP address of the OCS, and there we are. So it's asking me for a username and password. So I'll type in one of the usernames and passwords that I configured into WebMi, and I'll sign in. This is the very first time I've logged into WebMi using that username and password, so I'm getting this license agreement that I need to accept. So here's what my web pages look like. Again, I took the two screens that were running on the OCS and put them both on the same web page. And I added production data and preventative maintenance information. Now I have the ability to potentially make changes to things based on my username and password credentials and access level that I just logged in with. So that is the method for applying WebMi to the micro OCS. Thank you for joining us for today's tutorial, and the Q&A session will begin shortly.
Okay, I hope our presentation this morning has been beneficial for you. As I mentioned earlier, I won't be able to do the live Q&A, but the questions that have been brought in, they will be forwarded to tech support and they will be following up soon with you. Next week, we will have using Modbus TCP in a tag-based environment. You can find the sign-up link to this on our website, and all of our previous webinars are available on our website too to watch back. This one will be uploaded within the next few hours, so if you want to review it again, it will be available. Thank you all for your time this morning, and we hope to see you again next week for the next webinar. Bye-bye.